So I know it's early for you, but I have a quiz.
Oh no!
I have a quick quiz for you.
What?
Very, very quick.
Yeah.
So it's relevant to the conversation we're about to have.
Okay.
So this past Sunday was the 108th anniversary of something.
Of something?
What was it?
This past
some
Sunday?
event happens. This past Sunday was the 108th anniversary of an event that is relevant to the discussion we're going to have.
Oh my God. You know how bad I am at math? I don't even know 108 years ago. Wait, I'm going to figure it out. Hold on.
Okay.
108 years ago. It's now 2025, 1925. I don't know. I give up. The Balfour Declaration.
Oh, ding, ding, ding.
I got it.
Wow.
Oh my God.
I am thoroughly impressed.
Okay.
I thought I was going to embarrass you.
No,
frankly.
I got it.
That fails.
No, I know the Balfour. Okay. I'm glad. Thank God I got that.
Nice. Wow. I'm impressed.
It took me a second.
Let me ask our guest, Oren Kessler, author of Palestine 1936, if he's equally as impressed by that.
Oh my
by that poem by
God.
ChayaLeah.
I'm slightly less impressed. I have to admit, I would have gotten it like that.
Wow.
No, but for a normie,
Thanks.
for a normie, that's quite impressive. For someone who has not written a book about these things, pretty impressive.
Thank you.
That is pretty good. As soon as I saw, I was reminded of that this weekend. I said, I got it. I know I'm going to start this off. I'm going to start the podcast off by embarrassing ChayaLeah, but
yeah, I have no concept. I have no concept of time, so that I'm impressed with myself. But thank you for asking.
I'm impressed. I'm impressed.
I'm also impressed.
Welcome, Oren. This is very exciting to have you in real life. I mean, on Zoom, but in life, like it's exciting to meet you.
I'm very excited to be here. Same here.
This is
yeah. So this fits into a motif we've done recently, where we've done a podcast about the Harrison Report. We did a podcast on the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, and that was just sort of our hacked up version of history. But now we have a professional author and historian, journalist, Oren Kessler, to talk about his great book I have here, Palestine 1936, which won the Sandy Rohr Prize last year for Best Jewish Literature, and in 2023 was a top 10 book of the year in the Wall Street Journal. So that's high praise. High praise. And the best praise I can give you is, if you can see this, you can see all the dog ears on the book, which my mom would be very disappointed in me because she told me never to deface a book, but oh well.
No, that's cool.
As an author, I'm very flattered by the amount of dog ears in that book.
Okay,
I have the opposite attitude to your mom.
Glad.
Yeah.
Oren, did you actually write this book, or did you ask ChatGPT what happened in Palestine in 1936 and you just put it on a...
Well, given that my book came out in February 2023, and anyone who knows the book industry knows how glacially it moves, I can say I can prove that there was zero AI involved in the making of this book.
That's good.
Yeah.
I'm only asking because it's the only way I'll ever be able to write a book. So I'm just curious if anyone else.
I think GPT came out at some point in 2022. I think late 2022. So. Oh yeah. Yep. So I'm. Yeah. And it was impossible.
I did thoroughly review the book for M-dashes, and I did not find any. So that is clearly this was not ChatGPT created, because it would be all M-dashes throughout the entire book.
That's so funny.
So yeah, so welcome. We're really excited about having you on to talk about the book, because it's really it's terrific. I think one thing that's great about the book that I really like is it kind of scratches an itch for different types of people, depending on your level of knowledge. If you're a novice to the topic, you can come in and read it, and you set the groundwork well enough that you're not lost. It's not sort of esoteric in that way. But if you are very well read on the topic, you're going to learn a lot from this book. There's a lot of new information, a lot of new characters, if you will, that are introduced to the book. So it's really one of those rare books that is sort of hits on a bunch of different types of readers. So.
Well, thank you very much. That's really very, very kind of you to say, Jay. And let me just note that if you guys are doing entire episodes on the Anglo-American Commission, you're neck deep in this stuff. You're not hacks by any means. That is some niche stuff. Or the Harrison Report. I mean, that's esoteric.
I'd like to separate myself out here and say Jay is a massive nerd who spends a lot of time researching this stuff. I just listen. He discusses it, and I just come on to listen. I don't know. Don't ask me. I still don't know what the Harrison Report is. I
only have the vaguest idea. What year was the Harrison Report?
Oh man, it was
right after the war. No,
43, 4.
This is Harrison, not Morrison. Yeah,
right.
No,
right.
Harrison.
Okay.
It was essentially Truman found out that
it was after
Jewish
the war,
DPs,
so 45, 46.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. Yeah. That's
45, 46.
It was Truman found out, was getting word that the Jewish DPs were being mistreated in the camps, and so he got this guy Earl Harrison to go out and write a report on what he saw. And so that we talked about that. What he found in the report was recommendations were he recommended. This was just after the white paper ended, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit here. And so there was no immigration allowed into the Mandate area. And Harrison recommended 100,000 visas to be opened immediately. England said, like any good bureaucrat, I think it was Anthony Eden, if I remember correctly, was the PM then, said, let's have a commission. And that's where the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry came in. So
wonderful time in Jewish history.
Wonderful.
So Oren, why'd you write this book? Let's start with that, and then we'll get into details.
Well, I had always, maybe not always, but for many years, I had a somewhat masochistic urge to write a book about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't know why. My parents are Israeli, so I suspect that had something to do with it. But I discovered really very quickly that many other people had the exact same masochistic urge, and that the bookshelf was creaking under its own weight. And so I was quite discouraged by that fact until I found this gap on that said creaking bookshelf that really of this period of 1936 to 39, the Great Arab Revolt and everything that kind of emanated from it, all the repercussions of it. I really discovered that this was massively underexplored, underwritten about. Certainly in English, there was no book in English for a general audience on this period. It's the kind of thing that that usually got at most a chapter, if not a few pages, in wider histories of this conflict. And it really struck me that this was a really formative, seminal, decisive chapter in the history of this land, in the history of Zionism and Palestinian nationalism and the conflict. And one that was really populated by really fascinating, compelling characters on all three sides. And again, it's important to remember there are three sides here. There are the Jews, the Arabs, and the Brits. The Brits are running the show. And some of these were very well-known figures like Winston Churchill or David Ben-Gurion or the Mufti of Jerusalem. And others were rather more obscure or forgotten. And I sort of wanted to rescue them, revive them from semi-obscurity. So that's the relatively short version.
Awesome.
Really interesting.
So when we look at, the first Aliyah to the Mandate area started in around 1881, 1882, thereabouts. And then you, of course, have independence in 48. So, but 1936 seems like sort of a breaking point, sort of a very important year in that time horizon. Why should people care about the year 1936 in this whole series of events?
Well, it's April 1936 that what would become known as the Great Arab Revolt erupts. And oftentimes when I'm talking about my book, particularly to Jewish audiences, I'll get a certain reaction, which a reaction to the effect of, "Oh, you mean Hebron? You mean the Hebron massacre?" To which the short answer is no, not exactly. My book, the core of my book, begins 7 years after that. The Hebron massacre, as many of your listeners will know, was a very grim and gory and gruesome massacre in the city of Hebron and Tzfat and a few other places over a week in 1929, in which 133 Jews were killed in ways that recall the atrocities of October 7th, 2023. But I believe, and I sort of argue in the book, that that's quote unquote all they were. They were terrorism, they were massacres, but they didn't represent a concerted nationalist uprising. They didn't represent an intifada in the parlance of our times. The first time you see anything on that level of that kind of concerted nationalist uprising with political objectives is, to my mind, 1936 to 39. This is a 3-year revolt. This is a true intifada, massive cost in blood and treasure. This is a period in which 500 Jews are killed. And these are numbers we wouldn't see until the 21st century. And at a time when the Jewish population of the Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish population here, is at most 300,000. So these are, and half as many British servicemen as well are killed, about roughly 250.
Wow.
So these are massive numbers, not to mention the thousands of Arabs who were killed throughout this revolt, mostly by the British and their fellow Arabs, and we'll get into that. So this is just a massively consequential period in ways that it is certainly in terms of the body count, but also in other ways, politically, in so many ways. This is a watershed moment for all three sides involved in this Palestine triangle.
Can you compare and contrast the what's the right way to say this? Sort of the sentiment of what the future of the Mandate area looks like pre 1936 and post 1939.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but one of the reasons that I consider this a really watershed period is that this is the period in which you have the first two-state solution offered up by the British in this case. This is the first time a two-state solution appears on the international agenda in any real way. A two-state solution that includes a Jewish state. This is the first time this notion of a Jewish state appears on the international agenda in any significant way. So not just a Jewish national home, as promised by the Balfour Declaration, but a state with everything that means. That presumably means borders and an army and control over immigration. And so that comes really what the British, in response to this revolt, send over a royal commission, the famous to people like me, like us, Appeal Commission of 1936 to 37, which spends several months in the country and interviews dozens of Jews and Brits and eventually Arabs, because at first the mufti is boycotting the proceedings, but we can get to that later. And they go back to England and they produce a 400-page report, which history really remembers for its last 10 or 15 pages, in which they propose this radical notion of a two-state solution. And your listeners who have seen the maps produced by this commission will know that basically the Jewish state that they offer is significantly smaller than the current state of Israel. It's really sort of from around Rehovot, so just south of Tel Aviv, all the way up the coast, and then the Galilee, and then the rest of the Holy Land is an Arab state, potentially attached to Transjordan, and then there's a sort of rump mandate around Bethlehem and Jerusalem. But in any case, this is the big idea, and the Jews have a raucous debate, as we tend to do, but ultimately they come out and give the two voices that matter most are David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, and Chaim Weizmann, the head of the World Zionist Organization. And they signal their sort of tentative acceptance of this as at least a basis for negotiation, while the Mufti rejects it out of hand. But in any case, this becomes the template for every subsequent two-state solution, starting with the UN's exactly 10 years later in 1947, up until the various iterations that we know today. So that's just one example of the kind of before and after this tremendous watershed of the last years of the 1930s here in what was then Mandate Palestine.
I think when people think or talk about that time period, there's like a conception that, violence came from both sides, the Jews and the Arabs. Everybody was violent and everybody was attacking each other. Can you put into like some context, how the violence started? Where did it come from? And like, how did we get to, I mean, don't go all the way till today, but like, how did this conflict turn violent?
Well, this isn't the first time that blood is shed in this land in the 20th century. Many of your listeners will be familiar with the riots of 1920 and in 1920 in Jerusalem, 1921 in Jaffa and a few other places, famously 1929 in Hebron. So it's not the first time that blood has been shed, but as I mentioned, it's really the first kind of sustained revolt. And so it begins really kind of in spontaneous acts of violence. I should mention that there was a man whose name will be known to many folks who watch the news these days, and that's Ezzedine al-Qassam, who was a preacher, a jihadi preacher, we could say, in Haifa. He was originally from Syria, but he fled Syria because he was wanted by the French authorities up there. It comes down to Haifa in the beginning of the 1920s, and he's preaching a very, very extreme form of Islam. And he starts to sort of encourage his followers to wage acts of violence, and they do so, and they end up killing a number of Jewish civilians and British servicemen. And at a certain point, they kill a Jewish member of the Palestine police by the name of Moshe Rosenfeld, who incidentally was known as the best sportsman in Palestine. But at any rate, they kill this man, and now they're wanted by the British because they've killed a servant of the king. And so long story short, the British hunt down this man, Qassam. They kill him in what is now in the sort of Jenin, Nablus area. And he really becomes the first kind of martyr icon of the Arabs of Palestine. His face is on all the front pages of the Arab papers. And Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, very presciently says, finally, the Arabs have found a man who's willing to die for an idea or an ideal. And he predicted that dozens or hundreds or thousands more would follow in his wake. And that's what happens. A few months after, this is late 1935. By the spring of 1936, basically Qassam's followers sort of take revenge as they see it, or they ambush a Jewish elderly poultry merchant, again in the same Nablus, Jenin, Tulkarm area, and and they kill him and his driver. And these are sort of the opening shots of the Arab revolt, and then the violence spreads to Jaffa. Many people are killed in Jaffa in April 1936, and it's clear to everyone that this is a new phase. This is a new level of violence. But so the revolt begins in spontaneous acts of violence, but very quickly, the Mufti, who's the head of the Supreme Muslim Council and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the Mufti declares certain political demands. And implicit in these demands are that this violence will continue and this strike will continue because the Arabs also cut all contact with the British authorities and the Jewish economy. It's very clear that these acts of violence and of economic boycott will continue unless these demands are met. These three demands. Chief among them are a complete stop to Jewish immigration, a complete ban on land sales because very many wealthy Arab landowners were selling land at vastly inflated prices to Jewish institutions, Jewish buyers, even as they railed against this practice in public. And then the third demand was sort of to form a legislative assembly that would represent the demographics of Palestine, which were still about 70% Arab. So these were the demands. So it begins in violence, and then very quickly political demands follow. Just briefly, as to your question about kind of who is perpetrating the violence, come sort of as this revolt enters its kind of the 1 year mark, you start to see more and more Jewish violence as well. And you start to see on the more right-wing militant side of the Zionist ledger, the kind of revisionist side, the Irgun, the movement that's ideologically loyal to Vladimir Jabotinsky, you start to see more eye for an eye kind of measures, shall we say, attacks. You start to see, if the Arabs are going to lay bombs in our vegetable markets, we're going to lay bombs in theirs. So that's not to suggest that, and there is a point in late 1937 that actually more Arabs are dying at Jewish hands than vice versa. There's a certain moment when that's the case. Throughout most of these 3 years, that's very much not the case, but there is a moment that is indeed the case. Yeah.
Interesting.
So I want to come back to a point you made, something that since October 7th, I've had this conversation with numerous people, that people talk about how Jews stole the land. They stole the land of the Arabs, and having to explain to people that's not what happened. The land was sold to them by absentee landowners or people who just didn't, or who could get, like you said, 5 times the price for the land than it was actually worth. And you brought up the point that some of the people, like particularly people who were in the Arab Congress executive, who were outwardly talking about how we shouldn't sell land to the Jews, were actually doing it themselves. And like the mayors of Jerusalem and Jaffa and Gaza all sold land to the Jews. Why do you think that? So I guess 2 questions. Number one is, how did the practice of selling the land to the Jews start? And why were they trying to rile up their communities by telling them to not execute on a practice that they themselves were actually implementing?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, like most questions about this particular part of the world. But it's true. The figure that you cited there, something like half of the members of the Palestine Arab executive in Palestine sold land to the Jews. For what it's worth, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, I never found any evidence that he sold land. So there's a lot you can say about the Mufti, but he was consistent, and he had his truth, as they say, as the kids say these days. But many of his underlings and his that was kind of the norm and the rule. There wasn't a single prominent Arab family that didn't sell lands. Famously, the entire Jezreel Valley was bought up in the early 1920s from the Sursak family of Beirut, for example. Speaking of absentee landowners, and so it's the question of, there was one sort of essential backdrop to understanding this revolt is this growth in land sales. You have the spike in land sales in the 20s, and especially the first half of the 1930s. Land sales double in the first half of the 1930s. The population of Tel Aviv triples in the first half of the 1930s. The Jewish population doubles in that period. And much of this is driven by anti-Semitism in Europe. Hitler comes to power in January 1933, as we know, and other anti-Semitic movements are on the rise across Europe, in Poland and Hungary and Romania. And so you have this combination of really just skyrocketing Jewish immigration in this period. You have 60,000 Jews arriving in 1935, which is double the number of 2 years previous, and then just much higher land sales. So you have this irony where you have the Grand Mufti insisting that the British ban his own people from selling land to the Jews, right? Because he's admitting that his admonitions are not working, his sermons are not working because people are still selling their land, oftentimes swampy, malarial land to the Jews, and so it's a key issue. There's probably the most authoritative book on this subject. If some of your listeners are nerdy enough to really want to delve into this, it's a book called The Land Question in Palestine by Professor Kenneth Stein, which is really a groundbreaking book in which he really gets into the nitty gritty of land sales. And if memory serves, I think he also has an extensive index that tells you who sold what and where. But I could, if it's not weird, I could even read a few lines from my book that relate to this question, because I've got the whole book manuscript in my head, so I can. On page 106, I write the following: there was no notable family that had not sold land. And I'm reading this. I'm not so weird that I have this memorized, but of the 8 original members of the Arab Hire Committee, at least half had signed or brokered land deals. Jerusalem's former mayor, Rav Ibn Shashibi, sold ground at Mount Scopus to Hebrew University. Alfred Rock, a Catholic from Jaffa, sold land south of that city that became Bat Yam. Awni Abdul Hadi of the hardline Istiqlal Party mediated the sale of virtually all of Wadi Hawaris, the basin along the central coast that the Jews called the Hefer Valley. So it's really, again, even in the Mufti's inner circle, again, the Mufti, I have seen no evidence that he sold land, but his cousins and other members of his family very much did.
It's interesting because I never really thought about this issue much until a few years ago. The whole blow up with the area of Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem came to the front of everybody's mind, because there was this conflict in part of Jerusalem that the land is owned by actually, I think, American Jews, but the houses have been lived in, for decades. I mean, since the 1950s, I think, because Jordan owned, it was under Jordanian rule. And so they gave the houses to different families, and these families have lived in there continuously since then. And, when that story first broke, I immediately was like, they kicked the Arabs out and that's Jewish land and they bought it fair and square. And then I had an opportunity to visit Sheikh Jarrah and sit in some of those homes and talk to the Arab families that live there. And then I realized, it's not so simple. These people have literally, I sat with a man who grew up in that home, who's in his, he's an old man and he grew up there as a kid, and then his kids and his grandchildren live there. And it's really, really, that one tiny little snippet, it just shows you how complicated every inch of Israel is. And it made me rethink the whole owning the land and selling and how complicated it is. But it is. Most things around here are complicated. Yeah. And in the case of Sheikh Jarrah, it's extremely complicated. I think much of that neighborhood, or significant parts of it, were bought by Jews before 1948. Right. And then, as you mentioned, between 48 and 67, of course, it was under Jordanian rule. And then since then, after it came back under Israeli rule, I think you're right that certain American organizations have bought either more structures, or they've tried to reclaim these buildings that were Jewish owned before 48. But it's very complicated. Needless to say, once you open that Pandora's box, there are obviously, go down to Jaffa or many other places in this country, and you'll find buildings that were once Arab and are now Jewish owned. So it's complicated, but it's extremely complicated. Yeah. Yeah. If it was simple, we wouldn't have bookshelves of books and you wouldn't have anything to write about.
Right.
If this was a simple history, I mean, we need something to keep us busy.
Yeah.
On the land question, I read, I don't know if you've ever read Army of Shadows.
Yeah, excellent. It's an excellent book by Professor Hillel Cohen.
Oh, yeah.
Great book. I cite it quite a few times in my book. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. I'm glad you like it. Glad I didn't waste my time.
I liked it more than his book on 1929. No offense, Professor Cohen, but I thought it was really, really excellent. Yeah.
So one topic you talk about in the book a bit, which I'm sure is near and dear to your heart, is the newspapers of the time, and how there's Philistine and Al-Difa and Al-Jamia Al-Islamia and all these different papers from the region that are sort of telling in some cases same stories, in some cases different stories. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of the newspapers and the media at that time in fomenting what was occurring on both sides?
Yeah, there was a real flowering of Arabic media in Mandate Palestine, and during the Mandate, I don't have the figures offhand, but there's from just a really small handful of Arabic papers throughout the 20s and 30s. There's a really vibrant Arabic press and a Hebrew one, no doubt. But if we're looking at the Arabic press, I think by consensus, the highest quality paper was Palestine, which was published here in Jaffa by a Christian family, the Isa family, and it was one of the most illuminating, fascinating things I found in my research was this correspondence between the editor of Palestine, who was actually a Syrian Egyptian Christian guy named Yusuf Hanna, his correspondence with the local correspondent for the New York Times, who was a Jewish guy named Joseph Levy. I think Joseph Levy, yeah, who was an anti-Zionist, Jerusalem-born, Arabic-speaking New York Times correspondent, and this guy Hanna, the editor of Palestine, corresponded extremely candidly with this Times correspondent, and very often the things that he wrote in private correspondence were pretty diametrically opposed to what he published in Palestine. So Palestine was obviously an Arab nationalist, anti-Zionist paper, and so the editor was not Zionist by any stretch. But for example, the editor was extremely critical of the mufti in private correspondence. He was extremely worried about radical Islam in private correspondence. Of course, none of that made it into the pages of Palestine. But there's, I think, one of the most revealing quotes that I found, and which I used in the book, was when this editor of Palestine writes to this Times correspondent, and this is in the wake of, I believe this is in the wake of the Peel Commission report, the partition proposal. He basically says, look, there's not a self-respecting Arab in this country who wants to be ruled by Jews, but there's also not a single Arab worth his salt who wants to be ruled by assassins. And he's talking about the mufti and his coterie. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very honest assessment of where very many Palestinian Arabs stood in this period. Because it's really in this period, there's a kind of initial unity when the revolt erupts behind the mufti, where, at least on the face of it, all strands of Arab society unite behind the mufti in this great cause against Zionism and British imperialism. But really, as the revolt wears on, you've got Arabs shedding Arab blood in vast quantities, and that unity just kind of explodes. And you see rival families settling old scores under the cover of these ostensibly nationalistic reasons. And most of that, well, let's say much, is led by the mufti and his henchmen. Even after the mufti flees Mandate Palestine in late 1937 because he's a wanted man by the British by this point for fomenting this revolt. Even after he flees to Beirut, he's really pulling the strings of this revolt, even from exile.
Mm-hmm. So since we talked about the mufti quite a bit, could you just explain who the Nashashibis were and their importance to this?
So in this period, you really have two main camps in Arab Palestine. You've got the Husseinis and their allies, and then you've got their allied families, and then you've got the Nashashibis and their allied families. Sometimes the latter group is known as the opposition. And so, and they were very influential. They controlled several major mayorships. They used to be the mayors of Jerusalem, or rather, Ragheb Nashashibi was the mayor of Jerusalem through much of the Mandate, and they're the kind of perennial rivals of the Husseinis. And they were hardly Zionists themselves, but they were considered much more pragmatic in terms of their dealings with the Jews, the Zionist leadership, and indeed with the Brits. And so Ragheb Nashashibi, the mayor of Jerusalem, lets it be known, or I guess he's former mayor by this point, he lets it be known to the British once this partition plan is offered. He lets it be known privately, discreetly, that he's on board with this plan. There are other members of the Nashashibi opposition who let the British know the same thing. Emir Abdullah in Transjordan, the grandfather of the current king, lets it be known that that he supports partition. He had a certain something to gain in this plan because there was talk of attaching Arab Palestine to Transjordan. Right. But nonetheless, and there are other prominent Arabs. George Antonius, who's an Arab intellectual who writes a very influential book called The Arab Awakening in this period. He lets the British know that he's at least on board to discuss partition. Musa Alami, who's a character we can get into later if you like, who's sort of a Cambridge-educated lawyer and Arab nationalist activist, he lets the British know that he's on board. So really, this is one of these great what-ifs from this period. What if someone else had been appointed by the British to be the most powerful Arab and Muslim in Palestine? Because let's not forget, it was the British who appointed Hajj Amin to this position, and not just the British, but the first High Commissioner for Palestine, who was a Jew and a Zionist by the name of Lord Herbert Samuel, who, in perhaps the original sin of the primordial mistake of a century of great power mistakes in this land, was convinced by this 25-year-old Arab aristocrat that he was going to play nice with the Jews and with the Brits, and he turned out to be a bitter enemy of both.
It's so frustrating in the book. It's so frustrating in the book. The whole book, I'm like, no, stop. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't make that choice. I'm like yelling at the bricks the whole time.
But I think it is a really important point that I think people, when they talk about the current conflicts, they, to a certain degree, sort of hand wave it all away, saying, oh, this has been fighting for, 15,000 years or whatever, whatever people say about it.
I think, I believe Trump said 3,000 years, no? Or something.
Yeah, I think so. So. Yeah. But people just sort of say, oh, well, what do you expect? Like, basically it's what do you expect from, like, they're, they've been going on forever. This is always the way it's going to be. But I think it's really important for people to realize this could have gone a different way. Yeah. And this could have been different. And it is not inherent that the way it was then and the way it is today is the way it always has to be. I think it's really important people to understand that, I think.
What is the deal with Churchill? I feel like we talk a lot about, the British being responsible for the mess, or at least partly responsible for the mess. But Churchill, I always was taught was like a great hero. And the Brits, though, honestly, I went to Jewish day school. If you get a Jewish day school education in America, I think you walk away thinking the British are evil, terrible, awful people who the whole entire conflict in Israel is because of the British. And so it's just interesting because at the same, on one hand, we love Winston Churchill, great hero of World War II and etc. And I think you write in your book that he was pretty philo-Semitic. I mean, he loved, or at least, right, he seemed to like Jews and respect Jews and care about them. But now I'm told by many new historians who got their degrees in podcast university that, or comedy university, I don't know where, that, that's not the case. So as a real person who does real research, where do we stand with Winston Churchill today?
With Churchill, he's still good for the Jews. He's still good for the Jews.
Good. Thank God.
Yeah. Not 100% of the time, but on the whole, he shakes out pretty philo-Semitic, as you say, very pro-Zionist.
Yeah.
You could identify if you wanted, you could identify a certain anti-Semitic tinge in his pro-Zionism because he writes a notorious to people like me and like us article in, I think, the early 1920s in which he I think it's called Zionism or Bolshevism or something to that effect, basically saying the Jews are going to go one way or the other and better that they go Zionist, right? But he's on the whole a pretty stalwart friend of the Zionist enterprise. He probably envisions the Jewish national home growing within the British Empire, so that kind of aligns well with his stalwart imperialism. But he's also, it has to be said, very anti-Islam. He wrote some very harsh things about the Muslim religion. And yeah, he had some early, when he was a young man, he fought in Sudan. And I think that's when and some of his writings from Sudan show a very dim opinion of Islam and Muslims generally. You could say that these opinions were quite prevalent at the time, but he doesn't mince words. And so, but the British more broadly, look, I think most Israelis have the impression that you described, that the Brits were in it for themselves. They played each side off the other, and they caused all the problems here. And I think it's a little too facile and too easy. I think it's easier. I tell my Israeli friends who make this point, and maybe this is my Anglophilia showing, but there's a lot to blame the Brits for, but I don't think there would be a state of Israel in 1948 without the opportunities afforded by the British Mandate.
Yeah, it's true.
That's the Jews still had to rise to the occasion. They had to. The Brits weren't going to do anything for the Jews, but if you compare the growth of Zionism, the development of Zionism in the Ottoman era versus the British Mandate era, there's no comparison. In the Ottoman era, things crawled along. You had to bribe officials to get anything done. The Ottomans, expelled many of the Jews of this land during World War I because they considered them traitors. And so once you had the Balfour Declaration and then the Mandate, which enshrines the Balfour Declaration, this is often forgotten. But if you go to the kind of the text of the Mandate, which again, and I hope I'm not digressing too far here, but it's known as the British Mandate, but it's really a League of Nations mandate. Right. It's handed to Britain. So it's Britain acting on behalf of the League of Nations, the international community, if you like. And any gripes that anyone may have against Balfour or the British, they have to take up with the other signatories of the mandate. Italy, France, even America, which didn't join the League, signed a sort of side agreement saying that it was on board with this mandate that enshrines the Balfour Declaration and facilitates Jewish immigration and, quote, close settlements on the land. So all of this is to say the British Mandate created these opportunities that the Jews then had to raise the money for and bring the immigrants and do a lot of the heavy lifting. But there's a reason that the Jewish community here grows by leaps and bounds. And it's not just Hitler and Polish and Hungarian and Romanian anti-Semitism. It's also the opportunities that were afforded here. by the Mandate. And I would just add very briefly, probably the gravest sin that the British committed during the Mandate was the white paper that you mentioned earlier, Jay. The white paper in mid 1939, the hour of the Jews' greatest need, the most desperate hour for obvious reasons for the Jews of Europe, the British basically decide to appease, and this is the word that they use. This is the era of appeasement. This is the Chamberlain administration, to appease Arab and Muslim opinion, in their words, and so sort of respond to the Arab revolt by essentially rolling back and reneging on their Balfour Declaration promise. And they closed the gates of Palestine very narrowly, not completely, but I mentioned earlier that 60,000 Jews came in 1935. Well, according to the white paper of 1939, 75,000 Jews could arrive total over 5 years, after which any further Jewish immigration would be contingent on Arab consent, and everyone understood that consent would not be forthcoming. So from 60,000 a year to 75,000 over 5 years, and then no further immigration. So this was seen as a tremendous betrayal. And as you mentioned, Jay, after the war, after the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, the white paper remained in effect. And it really remained in effect until really the British leave in spring 1948 and the State of Israel is created. So there's ample room there to blame the British, for sure. We can let our imaginations run wild about how many people may have been saved from the gas chambers had the white paper not been in effect. But again, it's my impression that there wouldn't be a State of Israel in 1948. Maybe in 2048 there would be, or maybe, but if not for the Mandate. Yeah.
All right. Interesting.
Yeah. There's a bunch of things I want to say, but one thing I do, one thing you'll see, Oren, is when we have authors on, I like to read their books back to them.
Oh my God.
So there's one section I want to read really quickly about Churchill, which I've always been a huge fan of Churchill's. But there's one thing you wrote here that actually made me even a bigger fan of his. And you write about how in March of 1937, he met with, was the Peel Commission at that point?
Yes. Yeah.
So he met with the Peel Commission for what he believed would be a secret testimony. And he said, "I insist upon loyalty and upon the good faith of England to the Jews, to which I attach the most enormous importance, because we gained great advantages in the war. We do not adopt Zionism entirely out of altruistic love for starting a Jewish colony. It was a matter of great importance to this country. It was a potent factor on public opinion in America, and we are bound by honor. And I think upon the merits to push this thing as far as we can." And this was, this was a secret testimony that these were his true thoughts about this. And he sort of says, there were obviously benefits to England to doing this, and it was strategically the right thing to do. But there's also just the honor of it. And we made this commitment, and we need to stick by it, because this is important to us, it's important to them, and it's important to the perception of England to the world. And so, it's always one thing when a politician says something in public, but I think what they say behind closed doors is more revealing. So I think it's true. I think it's interesting. Absolutely.
And those secret testimonies were meant to be destroyed. Were they? Churchill and the other witnesses who gave secret testimony as opposed to public testimony, they were under the impression that no one would ever see the remarks. And it's only thanks to a very farsighted functionary who was the secretary of the committee, who stowed away a copy for safekeeping, that we have that testimony. And these secret testimonies were only declassified in 2017, 80 years after the fact. And so so Churchill's remarks had been published earlier by Martin Gilbert, his official biographer, but the vast majority of these secret testimonies, really, I was really one of the first people, if not the first, to publicize them. It was a gold mine. Yeah.
That's very exciting. That's awesome. Yeah. And I think the other thing too that's important to note about England, especially when you start talking about after World War II is that, and we talked about this in previous episodes, England was in a really bad spot. Economically, they were essentially devastated by the war. And this was the rise of needing access to oil and needing those natural resources the Middle East had. So, it's obviously as Zionists, you say, screw the British, like they screwed us over or whatever. But when you put yourself in their shoes, there was their practical reality they had to deal with of their own country. And so it's important to see things from both perspectives, that they were in a really bad spot after the end of the war.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off, Chaya, but let me
go. I'm going to change the subject in a minute. So finish off with this.
Well, it's also interesting to remember that during the very bleak years of the war, certainly for the Jews, during those awful years, the Jewish leadership, the Zionist leadership, was just waiting for the Labour government to come back to power in the UK. Because of course Chamberlain was a conservative, and it was under his administration that this great betrayal took place with the White Paper, and the Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, later a prime minister, denounced the White Paper completely as an evil decree that they would repeal as soon as they took power again. Ultimately, they didn't. The Labour government comes back to power after the war, Attlee and company, and they keep the White Paper in place. And it's then really that the mainstream Jewish leadership, the Haganah, the Ben-Gurion leadership, that they really start to rebel against the British in around 1946. And so the Arab revolt, that's the focus of my book, really is followed by a Jewish revolt that also lasts about 2-3 years, and which at first was led by the more extreme, the more radical right-wing Zionist movements, but which for at least a certain amount of time, the Ben-Gurion faction is also part of.
I want to ask you something that's hard for me, but you wrote in the book this line that stuck out, and I even stuck a little sticky note on it because it really stuck out to me. And you write here, and it's in regards to the revolt and the deaths that are happening, and I guess they're trying to negotiate with this guy Alami, right? And so but he's upset, and he said he wondered. So I'm going to read what you wrote. You wrote, he wondered if the Jews were truly interested in an agreement. They seemed to remember the Arabs' existence only when their security was in jeopardy, and just as quickly to forget them when it improved. And I'm wondering, because the last thing I like to do is self-reflection, but what could the Jews have done differently during those years? I mean, is it true that they only really cared about the Arabs when it came to their own security? And maybe if they would have focused on helping, improve the economic reality, or whether it was, more collaboration, where did we go wrong in those years that maybe could have actually changed the landscape?
Well, I think, I think, and if we're talking about Ben-Gurion, who certainly by the 30s is the most powerful, most important Jew in Palestine, Eretz Yisrael, Ben-Gurion, he has a series of meetings. I think this figure of Musa Alami, I think probably more people have asked me about him than anybody else. I think readers have really connected to this character. He's, as I mentioned, he's probably the first Arab from Palestine to attend Cambridge. He's a very brilliant guy, and he's an Arab nationalist, full stop. But he also has these relationships across ethnic and religious lines with Brits and indeed with Jews. And one of them is with Ben-Gurion, whom he meets with many times throughout the early 30s. And it seems to me that really. And they really meet in an atmosphere of, despite their politically diametrically opposed aspirations, they meet in a real atmosphere of respect and even warmth, and try to reach some kind of modus vivendi. And it seems to me that when those talks fail, and I won't reveal exactly why they fail, because then if I give everything away, nobody will read the book.
Exactly, read the book.
but the short version is the mufti. But anyway, when those talks fail, I think Ben Gurion becomes quite, I think he's personally offended, but I think he becomes quite resigned and fatalistic that the Arabs are ready for any kind of accord. And I think at that point, this is roughly 1933, 34, he kind of stops meeting with leading Arabs for quite a few years, and directs the bulk of his attention towards the issues of the day, which are immigration, settlements, immigration above all. Immigration looms over everything. It's strengthening the Jewish community demographically in the land, and equally, if not more so, getting Jews out of Europe. Right. That's key that's the immigration, aliyah. And so Ben Gurion really kind of redirects his attention towards the Brits and towards the kind of internal goals that the Zionist movement has, and towards getting favorable circumstances and conditions from the British leadership, and towards fighting the White Paper, and then the World War begins. So the kind of Arab question takes a back seat for quite a few years there. Yeah,
it's interesting. It's interesting because it's something that I think about even in our modern context a bit. It's like I would only blame the other side, but then when I did more learning and understanding and visiting, and I think about a place like East Jerusalem, and I think like maybe if we would throw tons of money at it and make it so much better living conditions, like maybe things would improve. And when I read your book, I was like, oh, that sounds pretty similar to like what we're asking ourselves now. It's the same question all these years later. It's like how can we deal with this in a way that might actually change the reality on the ground for the Arabs, which then might change their feelings towards us. And I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about that since October 7th, but it's definitely there in the back of my head all the time,
Yeah. And there were definitely then as now, there were very many different attitudes as to how much that would make a difference or wouldn't.
Right.
And, Moshe Shertok, who ends up being the first foreign minister of Israel and the second prime minister throughout this period, believes that the Jewish Zionist leadership isn't doing enough to win Arab hearts and minds, shall we say?
Yeah.
And I don't know who was right. I don't know if Shertok or Ben Gurion had the right approach. Yeah.
So on that topic, we've talked about Arab National Committee. We've talked about the Grand Mufti, and I think we've kind of gone down the road of explaining the various things they did that were probably exacerbated the situation. Was there anything, and you sort of maybe handle one of those things, but was there anything else the Shuv could have done or should have done that could have improved the situation or lessened the tension or whatever? Or was this just a result of the Mufti and the Arab National Committee's sort of obstinance?
It's a tough question. It's a tough question. I think at the end of the day, the kind of bottom line for both sides was demographic. The Jews wanted a majority. That was the ultimate goal, was a majority, so that you could have a democratic Jewish state, which eventually, or at least a democratic Jewish national home, and perhaps one day a state. The Arabs were equally, if not more determined, shall we say, to maintain an Arab majority. This is an era in which the world was moving, however hesitantly, towards democracy, towards popular sovereignty, away from empires. And so it was pretty clear to all sides that if one day the imperial powers wouldn't be here anymore, and or would take a back seat, and whoever had the majority would be calling the shots. So above everything, I think, above showing hospitality or learning each other's language or anything else, I think what made the biggest difference to Jewish-Arab relations was the demographic issue and land sales, but probably above all, demographics. I had another point I was going to make, but it's totally escaped me. So I'll end there.
What's your next book about? What are you going to write about next?
Yeah, as I told you earlier, the joke is joke that never stops being funny is when people ask me if the next book is going to be called Palestine 1937.
That is so funny.
To make that joke, you have to have not read my book, because the book, really, the core of the book is 36 to 39 people. So I don't know if hopefully there'll be another book, but I don't know. If anyone has any great ideas, they can hit me up on my website, orenkessler.com, or on Twitter, or on my Substack. Always open to ideas. It's
interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question.
You should write about Moshe Shartuk, because I always forget that he was even a prime minister.
Sharet. I should probably call him Sharet. Yeah, that's he Hebraicized his name.
It's true, and I always forget that he was even a prime minister. I don't know why I go from Levi Eshkol. Was he right after him? I feel like I go from Ben Gurion to Levi Eshkol.
I think Sharet only served 2 years, and he really only served because Ben Gurion just sort of bounced. Ben Gurion probably could have served well into the 60s if he had wanted to, but Ben Gurion leaves the scene at a certain point, and Sharet steps in, and then of course Ben Gurion comes back. But he's probably even better remembered maybe as Israel's first foreign ministry, because that was even in the pre-state era, he was basically functioning as the Yeshuv's foreign minister. And he was an Arabic speaker. He actually, in his youth, he lived several years with his family in an Arab village near Ramallah, believe it or not.
Wow.
He really fancied himself an Arabist and someone who understands the Arab population here much better than these other Ashkenazim, overwhelmingly Ashkenazim, who never bothered to. Interestingly, Ben Gurion, who was very, very skilled in languages and who learned Ottoman Turkish, which is an extremely difficult language, he only made really minimal efforts at Arabic for whatever reason. He ended up teaching himself ancient Greek so that he could read Plato. Taught himself English and spoke Polish and I believe Russian. Spanish, but he never really learned Arabic. And someone like Sharet would probably wonder aloud, why not? But
does Bibi speak Arabic? I wonder.
No, I don't think any. I don't believe any prime ministers other than Sharet have spoken Arabic to any.
That's interesting.
Any degree. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Well, if you want to make Jay happy, you should write a book about Menachem Begin. He'll be really happy. His hero.
That's been done. That's been done by Danny Gordis and others.
But your Substack is also great.
Yeah, it's great.
And I think, not that I know anything about publishing, but it seems like with all the attention now to the Mossad and all of the spy operations that Israel has pulled off, you have a terrific article on your Substack about, is it Yolande Harmer?
Yeah, exactly.
Pronouncing that?
Yeah.
Who, you can talk about her for a minute if you want to, but that seems like that would be a fascinating book. Thank
you very much. I've thought about it. I've been exploring that topic, and she was really, speaking of forgotten stories, she was probably Israel's most important spy in 1948, and nobody knows about her, not within Israel or beyond Israel. She was a spy in Egypt. She was born and raised in Egypt, and was very well connected. She was a very charming, attractive young woman, and she was very well connected among the Egyptian elite, among the British elite in Egypt, and she sort of revealed the Arab invasion plans to Ben Gurion, and at the hour of need, she actually flew to Lod Airport with the invasion plans sewed into her shoulder pad. Yeah,
wow,
and among other things, and she really had amazing sources. The son of the Grand Mufti of Cairo was a very good source. Some leading Lebanese, including a future prime minister, or was it the brother of the prime minister? Really high level sources. And and it's crazy because she ended up joining the Israeli delegation to the UN right in the early days of Israel. And then after that, she just went back to Egypt as if nothing happened. And she lived there for several more years until life really became untenable for her and the Jews of Egypt. And she moved here to Jerusalem and was really treated quite badly by the Israeli establishment. I mean, she was given really a very low-level clerkship in the foreign ministry. She never really fit in here. And tragically, she died very, very young of illness. She died in her early 40s, I believe.
Wow.
And in a further twist, her son, Gilbert de Botton, goes on to be a titan of world finance, innovates some financial thing that I don't understand at all and couldn't explain to you, but makes a boatload of money for himself and other people. And then his son, Alain de Botton, is a big, very talented writer and public intellectual in the UK. He writes excellent books about philosophy and so it's really quite a family and quite a story. And
interesting.
Yeah, I'm still exploring that story to see if there's enough meat there for a book. Yeah,
that's interesting.
It sounds like it's sort of comes from a similar vein of Monty Friedman's book, Spies of No Name. Is that?
Yeah, Spies of No Country. Yeah, great book.
No Country. That's right. Right. Yeah. But it seems like that topic scratches a bunch of itches. You've got the female protagonist. You've got the Israeli spy. You've got.
It does make me sad that, even in the last 2 years, to know all the things that Mossad was doing, right? Like, all the spies that we have in Iran and who we had in Hezbollah, and we'll never know their names, at least not now, and these are like the greatest heroes. I mean, people who've given basically their whole lives to be in these positions of power or whatever. I don't know exactly how it works, but and we don't know them. And I don't know that there's something so heroic about that, because these people know that they go into it knowing that they're not going to be famous. I mean, God forbid, unless you become an Eli Cohen, which I hope, doesn't happen to any of them, but it's really, I mean, what a kind of a person takes that upon themselves to do something for the Jewish state, for the Jewish people, and get no recognition almost for the rest ever. And so it's something I've been thinking a lot about the last 2 years, because I would never be able to do it. I would be WhatsApping every single person. Guess who I just met? Guess whose house I'm in? Like, guess who
I just assassinated? Yeah. Maybe in 40 or 70 years, once some of this stuff is declassified, then we, or more likely our kids or grandkids, will find out some of these names. But some of the most hardcore stuff, you're right, never gets declassified.
Yep. Well, I'm definitely not a spy, so then that's no one should ever.
You've cleared that up. Yeah.
That's exactly what a spy would say. So
exactly.
I don't know. Well, so Oren, if people want to read more stuff of yours, where should they go check you out?
Well, they should buy the book.
Yes.
And Palestine 1936.
Yes.
And they can check out my Substack, Oren Kessler. Just Google Oren Kessler Substack. Twitter, the usual places.
Awesome. Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you guys. This was great. This was great. This was great. You guys really know your stuff.
Yeah.
High compliments, high praise for sure. All right. Thanks everybody.
Bye.